They laughed at his limp. They whispered about his dark skin and slow steps. No one knew the janitor once led men through fire, chaos, and a war that even medals couldn't explain. But when a 4-star general walked through the school doors and saluted the same man they bullied, the silence was deafening, and the shame unforgettable. This isn't just a story about disrespect. It's a revelation of buried valor, hidden pain, and the brutal truth about how America treats its forgotten black heroes. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and worn-out adolescence. Lockers slammed shut like lazy gunshots as the first bell rang, scattering echoes down the long corridor. Fluorescent lights flickered above, their dull hum competing with the chatter of teenagers rehearsing their own importance. Among them, 3 boys strutted like royalty in sneakers too expensive to earn. Jason Halbrook, Chase Whitman, and Derek Collins, sons of the county's elite, walked with the entitlement of legacy. Their laughter was sharp, jagged, meant to wound. At the far end of the hallway, the janitor moved with quiet purpose. Mr. Elijah Darnell, in his navy blue uniform, walked with a deliberate limp, his right leg dragging slightly with every step. His posture, though slow, was dignified. He carried a mop and bucket like a soldier bears his rifle, not as a burden, but as a duty. His skin, deep and weathered like mahogany, bore the stories of decades, but not one word of them ever escaped his lips. Jason's eyes narrowed as Elijah passed. "Val," he elbowed Chase, "look at our war hero." The sarcasm was thick, sour. Chase snorted, slapping his hand over his mouth. Derek chimed in, loud enough to carry. $10 says he fought in the War of Walking Dead. Jason took it further. He exaggerated a limp, dragging one foot grotesquely down the hallway. "Attention," he barked, saluting in mockery. "Make way for Private Shuffle." His voice cracked into laughter. Phones were already out, recording. This was content. This was viral. This was cruelty wrapped in comedy. The kind that never feels wrong when your skin's the right shade. Elijah didn't stop. His eyes didn't flicker. He moved past them as if they were wind, as if their voices were nothing more than background noise in a life already filled with louder torments. But his knuckles whitened on the mop handle. A teacher saw it. Miss Cranston, mid-30s, coffee cup in hand, paused by her door. She frowned, lips parting as if to say something, then stopped. She turned and went into her classroom, slowly shutting the door behind her. Her silence echoed louder than the boys' laughter. "Hey, someone tag me," Jason called. "This is gold." Chase was already uploading it to Snapgram with the caption, "Limp Legend." Laughter followed them down the corridor, bouncing off lockers, ricocheting off memories they didn't know they were scarring. Elijah reached the end of the hall, opened the janitor's closet, and disappeared inside. The click of the door sounded like a lock on dignity. Inside, the small space smelled of bleach and old rubber gloves. He stood still for a moment. Then slowly, carefully, he reached into the inside pocket of his uniform and pulled out a photograph, black and white, worn at the edges. A younger version of him stood in a desert uniform, surrounded by other soldiers. One hand rested on the shoulder of a white man beside him, both smiling faintly, dust on their faces. He stared at it. His lips moved, but no words came out. Outside, the day went on. The students continued their parade of self-importance. No one asked where the janitor had gone, or how long he stayed in that closet. It wasn't the first time they had mocked him, but it was the first time it was filmed. That afternoon, in the teacher's lounge, a conversation simmered between indifference and discomfort. "Did you see that video?" asked Coach Freeman, tapping his phone screen. "The janitor thing?" Miss Cranston looked away. "It's not right." "Kids," he shrugged. "They don't know any better." "They're 17, she snapped. "They know exactly what they're doing." Mr. Langley, the history teacher, chimed in without looking up from his paper. "Well, it's not like Darnell ever says anything, just keeps his head down. Doesn't help himself much." There it was, the unspoken logic of bystanders. Silence means permission. Stillness means acceptance. But Elijah Darnell had not accepted a damn thing. That evening, after the school had emptied, the principal, Margaret Wells, remained in her office reviewing disciplinary cases. Her hair was pulled into a tired bun, her glasses perched low on her nose. She sighed as she watched the video for the 4th time. She knew those boys, knew their parents, knew what wouldn't happen. The phone rang. She picked it up, distracted. "Crestfield High, Principal Wells speaking." A deep voice replied, calm and unmistakably authoritative. "Yes, this is General Douglas Donovan. I need to speak with you regarding an incident involving your janitor, Mr. Elijah Darnell." Margaret blinked. I'm sorry, who did you say?" "General Donovan, United States Army, retired." I was informed of a video circulating online. The man your students mocked? He saved my life in Kandahar. Her hand trembled. I wasn't aware. You will be. I'll be arriving at your school tomorrow morning. Please ensure Mr. Darnell is present. And do me a favor, don't tell him I'm coming. I want to see if he still limps on the right. The line went dead. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her eyes wide. On the computer screen, the video played again. Jason's distorted voice echoed in the speakers. What's a crippled old janitor gonna do? What Elijah Darnell was about to do, or rather what the world was about to learn about him, would make every locker in that hallway feel like a headstone of ignorance. The next morning, Crestfield High would wake up to a lesson that never made it into their textbooks. The dawn crept over Crestfield High like a reluctant guest. Fog curled low around the school's faded brick, muffling the rustle of morning leaves and the occasional thud of car doors shutting. Before the first bus rolled up, before the janitorial crew even clocked in, Elijah Darnell was already inside, the keys to every hallway dangling from his belt like a chorus of ghosts. He moved with measured grace, broom in one hand, the limp still pronounced in his right leg. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes, deep and alert, scanned every floor tile, every smudge on the lockers, every forgotten gum wrapper like they were marks on a battlefield. His world was structure, precision, silence, and in that silence, he found his rhythm. Each morning, he began in the West Wing. He wiped down the trophies behind the glass case with the same care a mother might use to smooth a child's hair. His hands, though aged, moved with a practiced control, a soldier's touch. He didn't glance at the medals or plaques inside. He had more of his own tucked away in drawers no one ever opened. In the early hush, no one noticed him. That was the way it had always been. Elijah Darnell was the man you passed by, never through. His presence didn't require acknowledgement, or so the world around him had decided. To most of the students, he was just part of the scenery, the mop, the cart, the limp. He blended in like dust on the windowsill. But there was method in every step he took, even in the weight of his limp. Every day he arrived precisely at 5:32 a.m., took his place in the staff lot, never closer than the third row, and walked the perimeter of the school once before entering. Some believed it was habit. It wasn't. It was discipline. The remnant of a life he never spoke of. The way he kept his uniform pressed, shoes polished to a dull shine, keys arranged by size. It all screamed of military precision, but no one asked. They never did. In his closet-turned-office, tucked beneath the stairwell near the East Gym, Elijah kept a locker. Inside, along with a clean spare uniform, a flask of black coffee, and a box of weathered gloves, was a single photo. It was always tucked beneath a folded towel, never placed openly. The image showed a young black soldier, in desert fatigues, standing shoulder to shoulder with a pale-skinned man bearing lieutenant's stripes. Both smiled faintly, sunburnt, and squinting. Dust storm clouds loomed in the distance behind them. The back of the photo bore no name, only a date written in faded ink, July 17, 2002. No one had ever seen that photo. Not the faculty, not the students, not even the assistant janitor. It stayed hidden like a wound covered in gauze, not to be picked open again. Yet despite the quiet, Elijah noticed everything. He saw the side glances from some teachers, the pursed lips from parents during PTA meetings, the occasional flinch when someone realized they'd bumped into the help. To them he was old, poor, and black, the trifecta of invisibility in a suburban white neighborhood. And what they didn't know, they filled in with fiction. In the staff lounge, the speculation simmered. He must have been in jail before this, one teacher whispered one morning over lukewarm coffee. I heard he was homeless, another added, not even lowering her voice. He has that Vietnam look. You know what I mean, someone said with a smirk, drawing laughter. Ms. Cranston had said nothing. Again. No one knew about the silence Elijah endured each day, not just from their mouths but from their hearts. They didn't hear the way their indifference roared louder than any insult. They didn't feel the weight of existing in plain sight but never being seen. And so Elijah swept their floors, mopped their classrooms, wiped their fingerprints from glass as if erasing the very memory of their presence. At lunchtime, he avoided the lounge. Instead, he sat beneath the bleachers, eating a peanut butter sandwich from foil while birds circled overhead. He didn't look up when a stray basketball rolled near. He just finished his sandwich, brushed crumbs from his lap, and stood to return to his route. No one ever thanked him. No one asked him his name. But every clock at Crestfield ran on time because of Elijah. Every toilet flushed. Every hallway gleamed. Every snowstorm left behind dry stairs and salted walkways because of him. Still, no plaque bore his name. No email ever acknowledged his work. And yet, every time he passed by the ROTC classroom and saw those shiny young students in stiff uniforms talking about war like it was a game, Something in his expression flickered. Not anger, not envy. Just something deeper. Something only men who've tasted death and survived its silence ever wear. There had been one moment, just one, when his history nearly slipped out. 3 years prior, a teacher caught sight of the scars running down his shoulder when he rolled up his sleeve to fix a broken heater. They were ugly, winding things, the kind that bullets or fire leave behind. She'd asked quietly, "Accident?" Elijah had nodded. That was all. She never asked again. But even in his silence, Elijah had moments no one knew about. Sometimes he stood alone in the gymnasium, staring at the faded American flag hanging from the rafters. Once a year, on November 11th, he stood exactly 12 paces from it, hands behind his back, head slightly bowed for exactly 1 minute. He never said why. What students laughed at as a limp was actually a war wound. Shrapnel had torn through his knee and lower calf when he dragged 2 injured men across live fire in Kandahar. One of them had been General Donovan. But Elijah never spoke of it, because speaking did nothing in a world that stopped listening after the first word from a black man. And still, every locker he cleaned, every floor he waxed, he treated as if it mattered, as if it was proof that he still did. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, the memory of a time when he wore a different uniform never left him. It didn't matter if they called him the janitor, now. He knew who he had been. That had to be enough. Until it wasn't. At dusk that same day, after the mocking, after the laughter, after the silence, a sleek black limousine pulled into the school parking lot. Its windows were tinted, body gleaming like a promise no one believed. Elijah saw it as he carried out the trash behind the cafeteria. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly, but said nothing. He watched as the door opened slowly, and a tall gray-haired man in a tailored suit stepped out. The man didn't look around. He simply stood for a moment, facing the school's main entrance. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a gold coin-sized medallion, and tucked it into his breast pocket. He hadn't rung the front office. He hadn't spoken a word. But Elijah knew that stance, that bearing, that silence. He knew a soldier when he saw one. As Elijah turned to walk back inside, the man looked directly at him from across the parking lot. Their eyes met. Neither smiled. Neither waved. But in that shared moment, something unspoken passed between them. Heavy, loaded, and full of a past. Crestfield High was not ready to remember. And tomorrow, they would have no choice. Morning arrived with an unusual stillness at Crestfield High. The fog had lifted, but the air carried a weight no one could name. Elijah Darnell arrived at his usual time, 5:32 a.m., keys in hand, footsteps steady, despite the slight drag of his right leg. The building opened to him like a memory, one he maintained but never belonged to. By 8:15 a.m., the parking lot buzzed with student cars, bike tires screeching, the familiar chaos of a school morning unfolding. Yet amidst the ordinary, something extraordinary crept in. A line of black SUVs rolled up slowly, headlights on even in daylight. Their movement was deliberate, synchronized, unsettling. As the lead vehicle stopped near the flagpole, its polished frame reflected the morning sun like a badge of authority. Students, initially distracted by phones and routines, began to notice phones tilted up, fingers pointed. A few laughed, assuming it was for some local event. Veterans Day early? Someone joked. Others shrugged, uninterested. Inside, the intercom buzzed faintly as Principal Margaret Wells set down her coffee, her brow already furrowed. She hadn't scheduled any assemblies, no guest speakers, no military partnerships in place. She looked through her window and saw them, 6 men and women in full dress uniform, stepping out one by one, posture crisp, faces unreadable. Her heart skipped. Across the building, teachers peeked through blinds. Coach Freeman dropped his coffee. Ms. Cranston stepped back from the window like it had bitten her. The students, meanwhile, leaned into the spectacle. "It's gotta be a recruitment thing," Chase said, half laughing. "They'll probably show us some army video and give out dog tags or something." Jason wasn't so sure. His eyes narrowed as he watched a tall, broad-shouldered man in a white-trimmed uniform step out from the third SUV. His medals gleamed against his chest like a second rib cage. There was a commanding gravity to him, the kind that didn't ask for respect but expected it. That man was General Douglas Donovan. He wasn't there for a speech. He wasn't there to inspire. He had a mission. Inside the school lobby, the front office fell into an awkward hush as the secretary looked up from her keyboard. "Can I help you?" General Donovan didn't smile. "I need to speak with your principal. Immediately." Moments later, Principal Wells stood face to face with him, heart racing, palms damp. "I'm General Donovan," he said, voice calm but cut with steel. I believe you were informed I would be coming. I? Yes, she nodded. I didn't know it would be like this. He didn't respond. Instead, he removed a sealed folder from under his arm and handed it to her.
This is the full-service record of Master Sergeant Elijah Darnell, he said.
Her breath caught. I didn't realize. You weren't meant to, he replied. But your students made it necessary. At that moment, a bell rang. Second period. Hallways flooded with students, and as Donovan and his group stepped into the corridor, the chatter quieted. Heads turned, whispers broke out like brushfire. Teachers stepped into doorways, curious and alert. The presence of such high-ranking military officers in their pristine uniforms was nothing short of cinematic and unsettling. Donovan continued walking, flanked by two other officers, his boots clicking softly against the polished floor that Elijah had cleaned just an hour before. The man whose past had been ignored now had his future announced by thunder. At that exact moment, Elijah emerged from the West Wing, mop in hand, unaware of the stir. He stopped mid-step as the sea of uniforms parted around him. The hallway held its breath. Donovan's eyes found him instantly. They hadn't seen each other in over 15 years, but there was no doubt. He stepped forward, his voice steady and unmistakable. Master Sergeant Elijah Darnell, he said, loud enough for every curious ear, every mocking student, every complacent teacher to hear. I've been looking for you. Gasps rippled down the hallway like falling dominoes. Students who had laughed at Elijah just days earlier now stared in stunned silence. Jason's face went pale. Elijah didn't move. His eyes flicked to the generals, not in recognition, but in restraint. Then, slowly, he straightened his spine, still holding the mop. I'm no Master Sergeant anymore, he said, voice deep and quiet. You never stopped being one, Donovan replied. Principal Wells cleared her throat, stepping forward. General Donovan, perhaps we can take this to my office. Donovan raised a hand, silencing her without a word. He turned, looking down the hall at the rows of stunned students and frozen teachers. This school disrespected a hero, he said plainly, not shouting, just stating. And I'm not here to have coffee or shake hands. I'm here because this man, he gestured to Elijah, deserves more than an apology. He deserves recognition. He deserves truth. Elijah looked away, his jaw clenched. One of the students dared whisper, wait, he was in the army? Miss Cranston stepped out of her classroom slowly, her face unreadable. Elijah remained still, his face a mask. But inside, something churned. Not pride, not vengeance, just the slow rising wave of something he had buried for years, something he feared as much as he needed. Across the hall, Jason lowered his phone, suddenly aware that no part of this moment belonged to him. General Donovan stepped further into the hallway, commanding attention without trying. And then, in a voice that would echo in Crestfield High's walls long after the day ended, he asked the question that would split the school's history in half. Where is Master Sergeant Elijah Darnell? He said again, louder now. Not to Elijah, but to the entire school. The walls seemed to shrink. The laughter from earlier in the week died in memory. And the students realized they hadn't just mocked a janitor. They had humiliated a legend. And tomorrow, they'd learn just how much that mistake would cost. The hallway was still trembling with silence after General Donovan's question. Where is Master Sergeant Elijah Darnell? Had not just echoed. It had settled into the bones of every student and staff member. The name Master Sergeant was not one they had ever heard attached to Elijah. To them he had no rank, no history, no power. Just a limp, a mop, and a uniform that reeked of bleach. But now the world tilted. Elijah stood unmoved, the mop still in his hand, fingers loose around its handle like a soldier resisting his rifle after retirement. His expression hadn't shifted, but his posture had slightly straighter, a hair taller. A presence unfolding, not deliberately, but inevitably. Donovan turned to the crowd of students, speaking not with performance, but with precision. You see a man in coveralls. You saw a limp and made it a punchline. You saw dark skin and thought, less. You mocked what you couldn't fathom. And now, I'll tell you what the United States Army knows about the man you humiliated. Every student's attention was riveted, not a phone recording now. Something about Donovan's voice demanded more than curiosity. It demanded respect. In 2002, during Operation Anvil Spear in Kandahar, a convoy of 27 soldiers, myself included, was ambushed in a valley known for swallowing men whole. It was supposed to be a brief supply run, but it became one of the bloodiest firefights of the war. He glanced toward Elijah, who didn't move. One made the call to circle back under live fire, while 2 units fled under command of Fear, This man ran toward the burning Humvee I was trapped in. He dragged me out with a bullet through his side and a grenade blast tearing through his right leg. The gasp that followed wasn't dramatic. It was stunned, involuntary. The kind that happens when someone realizes they've mistaken gold for rust. Donovan's voice grew heavier. He didn't stop there. He went back twice more, pulled 2 more men out. When the medevac arrived, he passed out from blood loss. He nearly died in the field hospital 3 times. And yet, he turned fully, now addressing both students and faculty. He was denied the Medal of Honor. He was passed over for promotion. His name was scrubbed from the mission debriefings. Principal Wells spoke, her voice trembling. But why? Donovan's jaw tightened. Because Elijah Darnell refused to falsify a statement about his superior officer, a white major who abandoned us in the valley and later blamed the chaos on Elijah's aggressive disobedience. Every word felt like a nail hammered into the floor of that hallway. He could have taken a deal, Donovan said. Sign the paper, stay quiet, get your promotion. But he wouldn't. He told the truth, and the truth cost him his leg, his pension, and his name. Now the whispers were gone. Even the teachers looked hollowed out, blinking at a version of Elijah they had never allowed themselves to imagine. Donovan continued. Softer now. When I recovered, I tried to correct the record. I submitted the video footage, the radio logs, my own testimony. But they had already buried it. Bureaucracy doesn't forgive black truth-tellers. It silences them. He stepped closer to Elijah now, eyes not softened but burdened. I owe my life to you, he said, and I failed to give yours the justice it deserved. Elijah didn't reply. His gaze remained fixed on a spot just over Donovan's shoulder, eyes distant, as if watching something long gone. But someone else stepped forward. Miss Cranston. Her voice hesitant but honest. Why didn't you tell anyone? Elijah turned his head slightly, because it wouldn't have mattered. That sentence hit harder than any uniform or medal could. No one challenged him. Because everyone, deep down, knew he was right. He had walked these halls for 15 years, scrubbed their dirt, picked up their mess, endured their silence, and they never once asked his story. They were never curious about his limp, never questioned his discipline, because their version of him was enough. A janitor, a shadow, a service. And yet, here stood a man who had led platoons through enemy lines, who had bled for a flag that waved freely while hiding his name. Donovan pulled a thin case from his coat pocket and opened it. Inside lay a medal, not the Medal of Honor, but the Distinguished Service Cross. It gleamed softly, unpolished but proud. I had this reissued with your name properly engraved, Donovan said, offering it. Elijah didn't take it. I didn't come here for medals, he said. I came here to work. Donovan looked at him, pain flickering in his eyes. Then let them see who you are. Let them know what they tried to bury. Elijah's lips tightened. He said nothing. But something else shifted in that moment. The students no longer looked at Elijah with curiosity or pity. They looked at him the way people look at a monument they'd walked past their whole lives, only to discover it had a story far deeper than they could comprehend. Donovan turned toward Principal Wells. I'm requesting a full school assembly, he said. Every student, every teacher. They need to hear this officially, from me. Wells nodded, too stunned to resist. I'll make the announcement. But before she could reach the intercom, Donovan held up a hand. One more thing, he said, eyes sweeping the hall. I want the 3 students responsible for mocking Sergeant Darnell to stand front row, not for punishment, but for education. Jason, standing silently near his locker, suddenly felt his chest tighten. He couldn't breathe. His face burned as every eye turned his way. As the students began to buzz with tension, the intercom crackled overhead. Principal Wells' voice came through, shakier than usual. Attention all students and staff, there will be a mandatory assembly in the auditorium in 10 minutes. I repeat, this is a mandatory assembly. Her voice paused, then returned with one final chilling line. And bring your silence. The announcement rang through the school like a gavel. Mandatory assembly, in 10 minutes, and bring your silence. It was a strange command, but no one questioned it. Not after what they had seen in the hallway. The uniforms, the stare between Elijah and the general, the sudden reversal of reality. Teachers ushered students into the auditorium with uncharacteristic urgency. Even the troublemakers fell quiet. Something had shifted in the air, and whatever it was, it didn't feel like a school pep rally. The auditorium, a wide room lined with blue seats and dim stage lighting, filled faster than it ever had before. No one talked. Not even Jason, who now sat near the front row, his face pale, knees bouncing with anxious energy. His friends, Chase and Derek, flanked him but had lost their swagger. Their eyes stayed locked on the stage as if it might judge them. At the center of it all stood General Donovan, unmoving, waiting. When the last student was seated, Principal Wells stepped up to the podium and adjusted the mic. Her voice was low and brittle. Today is not an ordinary day. Today you're going to learn the truth about someone most of you ignored, and some of you mocked. She turned to Donovan, stepped aside, and let history walk up. The general didn't need a microphone. His voice cut through the silence without effort. My name is General Douglas Donovan, U.S. Army, retired. I've served this country for over 30 years. I've seen men break under pressure, soldiers abandon their brothers, and commanders lie for convenience. But I've also seen something else, something rare: integrity, honor, selflessness. He paused, letting those words sink in. And that is what Master Sergeant Elijah Darnell is made of. A murmur swept through the crowd. Whispers, jaws slightly parting. Students leaned forward, stunned. A few teachers looked down at their hands. Donovan reached into a leather-bound folder he had placed on the podium. He pulled out several documents, slowly laying them across the podium. What I'm holding is a redacted version of Sergeant Darnell's military file. Even now, much of it remains classified. But what I can show you is enough. He lifted the first document: Commendation for Valor Under Fire in Kandahar, wounded while extracting wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle. The second: Citation for Battlefield Command after his superior abandoned the mission. He led a countermove that saved 16 lives. The third: Letter of Reprimand, for refusing to support a falsified report blaming the incident on aggressive behavior by a non-compliant subordinate. That subordinate was Sergeant Darnell. The superior officer was later promoted. Elijah was forced to resign. A cold wave rippled through the crowd. Donovan continued. They silenced him, erased his awards, denied him a proper pension, and so he left the battlefield and found work in schools like yours. He paused, letting that fact hover in the air like smoke. Do you know what it means when a man who once led soldiers into fire now cleans your hallways? Donovan's voice sharpened. It means this country gave him a mop instead of a medal. It means racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it erases. Students blinked, stunned. Some looked at Elijah, who sat near the side wall, arms folded across his lap, eyes cast down, emotion unreadable. You mocked a man who led my soldiers through hell, Donovan said, finally turning to face the crowd. And I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to show you what ignorance costs. He nodded to the aide beside him, who opened a silver case and revealed 4 medals, glinting under the soft stage lights. The Distinguished Service Cross, Donovan said, holding one up. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and this. He lifted a patch from a small wooden box. This is the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment, worn by men who run toward fire while others flee. He placed them on the table gently. All belong to your janitor. Gasps, soft but real, broke through the crowd. A girl in the third row wiped her eyes. Donovan looked around the room, scanning every face. I don't expect you to understand war or sacrifice, but I do expect you to understand basic decency. I expect you to understand that the uniform a man wears today does not erase the ones he wore before. And I expect you to ask yourselves this: why didn't anyone here ever ask who Elijah Darnell was? The silence deepened. Principal Wells shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. Then Donovan's tone hardened. His words came slower now, deliberate and weighted. But now I want to know something else. Who mocked him? Students stiffened. Who recorded him limping down the hallway like it was a joke? Whispers broke out. All eyes turned to the front row. Jason swallowed hard, his breath caught in his throat. Donovan stepped down from the podium, walking across the stage like a man pacing a battlefield. He wasn't angry. He was surgical. I don't want to hear excuses. I don't want to hear I didn't know, because ignorance isn't innocence. Silence isn't blamelessness. He stopped in front of Jason's row. Stand up, he said. It wasn't a request. Jason didn't move. Donovan's voice deepened. You had the courage to mock a man who's bled for you. Now show the courage to face him. Jason stood slowly, his legs shaking. He looked like a child, stripped of his illusions, exposed in front of a room that no longer saw him as popular, just pathetic. The auditorium was still. Donovan didn't berate him, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he said something far more devastating. Tell me something, son. What exactly were you laughing at? His limp? His age? His uniform? Jason's voice cracked. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Donovan corrected. Because it's easier to disrespect someone when you pretend they have no story. He turned to the room. And every one of you who stood by and laughed, every teacher who saw him and said nothing. You weren't silent because you didn't care. You were silent because you didn't think he mattered. The words landed like a hammer. Elijah, still quiet, finally looked up, not at Jason, not at Donovan, but at the students. And then he stood. For the first time in 15 years, he stepped onto the stage, not as a janitor, not as an invisible man, but as Master Sergeant Elijah Darnell. He faced the crowd, not smiling, not angry, just present, entire, real. A teacher in the back began to stand in respect, then another, then students followed. Row by row, silently, a standing ovation rose, not out of pity but shame and awakening. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't need to. As the applause faded, Donovan stepped back to the mic, his voice calm again. I have one final request. He paused, scanning the stunned audience. I want every student and teacher to write down one thing. What would you do differently if you knew who someone really was? And then glancing to Principal Wells, he added, because starting tomorrow, this school is going to carry Elijah Darnell's name. The auditorium erupted in stunned gasps. And in the front row, Jason sat back down slowly, unaware that Elijah had just walked past him, and dropped a folded note in his lap. The note in Jason's lap felt heavier than it should have. Folded with military precision, the paper had no markings on the outside, just clean, sharp edges, the kind that don't let you look away. His fingers hovered over it, hesitant, trembling. Around him, the crowd of students began murmuring again, but quieter now, unsure whether to process what had happened or prepare for what might come next. He didn't open the note. He couldn't. General Donovan returned to the center of the stage, the echo of applause still lingering like smoke after a fire. His eyes roamed the sea of teenage faces. They weren't the same faces that had entered this room 15 minutes ago. These were changed, some ashamed, some stunned, and others just beginning to wake from the fog of their privilege. Donovan's voice cut through the hush again. Some of you may not have meant harm, he said, but harm doesn't need intention, it just needs neglect. He let that sit, then his eyes landed on Jason. You, he said flatly, stand up. Jason blinked, already standing in his own mind, already exposed. But now it was real. He rose slowly, his legs uncooperative, his heart pounding a rhythm that had nothing to do with pride. He wasn't the confident voice of those locker room whispers anymore. He was a boy surrounded by truths he hadn't earned the right to touch. Donovan's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. State your name. Jason Halbrook, he managed, barely audible. Louder, Donovan said. Jason Halbrook, he repeated, voice cracking. General Donovan stepped closer, his chest inches from Jason's, and stared into the boy's pale, sweat-beaded face. You dishonored a man I salute, he said, voice like gravel and steel. So now you apologize, not like a scared boy trying to avoid punishment, like a soldier, like a man who understands what it means to face what he's done. The weight of the moment fell squarely on Jason's shoulders, and everyone could see it. His eyes darted toward Elijah, who remained still near the edge of the stage. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. His face remained unreadable, like stone carved by fire. I'm sorry, Jason began, choking on the words. I didn't mean… No, Donovan interrupted, not cruelly but firmly. Stop, don't apologize for what you didn't mean. Apologize for what you did. Jason's lips quivered, his throat closed. And then the walls finally cracked. I mocked you, he said, his voice shaking. I disrespected you. I laughed at what I didn't understand. I thought you were just a janitor. I didn't care to ask who you really were. He turned to Elijah now, eyes filling. And I'm sorry. Not just for what I did in the hallway. I'm sorry for every moment I chose not to see you. The room was silent. No cheers. No validation. Just stillness. Elijah remained silent. It was not out of coldness. It was discipline. Decades of it. Because Elijah knew something the rest of them were just beginning to learn, that apologies don't erase what was done, and silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's power. Sometimes it's a mirror. Donovan stepped back, letting the room absorb what had just transpired. Jason sat down, visibly deflated. He opened the note finally, hands trembling. Inside were 4 words, written in perfect blocky script. Strength walks in silence. No signature, but he knew. From the back of the auditorium, Ms. Cranston shifted in her seat, eyes glistening. Across the room, Even Derek, Jason's friend and fellow mocker, sat hunched forward, fingers clenched together, eyes wet with guilt he didn't yet know how to process. The spotlight wasn't needed. The truth had illuminated more than any light could. Donovan looked at Elijah, nodding once, then turned to the crowd. "You saw a man limp and decided it meant weakness," he said, his voice quieter now. "But there's something you all need to learn." He motioned for Elijah to step forward. Still, Elijah didn't move. Instead, he slowly lifted his chin, scanned the room, and finally stepped up to the mic. He took his time, the limp visible but unapologetic. His hands gripped the podium like he'd gripped steel before. The auditorium held its breath. He looked at Jason, then Chase, then Derek, and then at Principal Wells. Finally, with a voice that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than memory, Elijah spoke, just one sentence. A sentence so quiet it shouldn't have shaken the room the way it did. But it did. "I buried better men than all of you." And with that, he stepped down, leaving the auditorium in stunned, irreversible silence. Because now, the lesson had just begun. The auditorium sat frozen in the shadow of Elijah Darnell's words. "I buried better men than all of you." No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. Even the creak of a folding chair would have felt like sacrilege. The sentence wasn't shouted, yet it cracked like thunder through the soul of every student, every teacher, and most of all, every witness who had ever looked at Elijah and only seen a limp. But what none of them knew, not even Donovan, was that Elijah wasn't finished. He turned back toward the microphone, his movements slow, deliberate. He stood there a moment, the silence stretching, pregnant with anticipation. Then, with a breath that carried years of war, work, and wounds, Elijah spoke again, this time without flinching. "Do you want to know what dying looks like?" he asked, his voice low but firm, his accent laced with southern gravel. "It's not loud. It's not even always bloody. Sometimes it's watching a brother scream for his mama with his chest torn open, while you use your own body as a shield. Sometimes it's dust filling your mouth while you dig through twisted metal, hoping the leg you're pulling still has a man attached to it." Students leaned in. Even Jason, whose shame had painted his face bone white, couldn't look away. Elijah's eyes went distant. "I died 3 times in Afghanistan. Not literally. I mean the kind of dying that takes your faith, then your hope, then finally your name." He paused. "The first time was when I watched my commanding officer, a white man with polished boots and a hollow spine, abandon us when the enemy ambushed. He ran, left us to burn. I didn't run. I went back, pulled out who I could, dragged Donovan out of a flame-eating Humvee with a bullet in my own gut and my leg hanging on by shreds." No one whispered now. They listened the way you do, when truth is telling on a country. "The second time," Elijah said, "was when I woke up in the field hospital and found out that man got promoted, got medals. I got a discharge, said I was unfit for duty, unfit because I didn't sign their lie." Donovan closed his eyes slowly. He already knew this part, but hearing it from Elijah, finally hearing Elijah speak it aloud, was like swallowing glass. "The third death came later," Elijah continued, voice now steadier. "When I came home and found out I wasn't a soldier anymore, I was just another black man in a country that only likes us when we're wearing their uniform, dying in their wars, or scoring points in their stadiums." The words struck deep. Ms. Cranston covered her mouth. Even Coach Freeman, who had once dismissed Elijah as just quiet, stared at the stage like he was seeing it for the first time. "Y'all look at me and see a janitor, but I've carried more weight than any of you ever will. I've held the last breaths of braver men in my arms, men who called me brother with their dying gasps, and men who couldn't stand my skin while they lived. I've seen racism wrapped in flags and folded into coffins, so don't you think for a second that your little hallway joke was original." He gripped the podium tighter. "You don't have to lynch a man to kill him. Just forget him. Bury him in silence. Walk past him every day like his story don't matter." The auditorium held its collective breath. "I wasn't angry when y'all laughed. I wasn't even surprised. But what breaks me," he paused, eyes glistening now, "is that none of you ever asked who I was, not once. And you think that's nothing, but let me tell you, being ignored long enough makes you question if you ever existed." Jason's eyes welled with tears again, and this time, he didn't wipe them away. Elijah continued, his voice a little softer now. "I chose this job because I needed peace, not because I couldn't do more. After the battlefield, I wanted floors that didn't bleed, halls that didn't echo with gunfire. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd find quiet here. But quiet isn't peace when it's full of judgment. You gave me silence that stung." Donovan's hands were clenched at his sides. He hadn't heard Elijah speak this way since the war, Not even to him. Elijah looked across the room now, catching eyes, holding them. Some of you are going to leave this school and become lawyers, doctors, officers, and some of you will carry your father's hate with you, dressed in new clothes. But I want you to remember this. I walked through fire to save men who wouldn't have shared a lunch table with me back home. I put my body in front of bullets for a flag that never shielded mine, and I mopped your floors with the same pride I held a rifle because I never needed your approval to be whole. No applause followed. Just reverence. Elijah stepped back, releasing the podium as if shedding armor he'd worn too long. General Donovan looked at him, not as a commander, not as a subordinate, but as a brother in arms whose silence had spoken louder than a battlefield eulogy. Principal Wells rose slowly from her seat. Elijah, she began, voice brittle. But before she could speak another word, the side door to the auditorium burst open. A woman, mid-40s, blonde bob, power heels clicking with fury, stormed in with the posture of privilege and a face flushed red with indignation. It was Jason's mother, and her voice rang through the room like entitlement, given form. "What the hell is going on in this school?" she shouted, eyes zeroing in on her son. "Why are military men humiliating my child? Who gave permission for this kind of assembly?" Jason sank in his seat. The temperature of the room dropped. Donovan didn't move. Elijah's face was unreadable again. And Principal Wells turned pale as the woman marched up the aisle, voice growing sharper with every step. "You people think it's okay to traumatize teenagers now?" she snapped. "My husband is on the board. You're going to regret this." And then her eyes met Elijah's. And for a split second, just one, something flickered in her gaze. Recognition? No. Fear. Because Jason's mother knew Elijah. Not from this school. Not from a janitor's uniform. But from a courtroom. 17 years ago. And she had hoped he'd never remember her face. The moment Jason's mother stepped into the auditorium, the temperature of the room changed. Her voice, sharp and slicing, cut through the heavy silence like a blade wrapped in entitlement. "What the hell is going on in this school?" she demanded, her designer heels clicking up the aisle. "Who allowed this disgraceful display? What kind of trauma are you pushing onto our children?" Jason shrunk further into his seat, his face pale, ashamed, lips pressed into a line so tight they nearly disappeared. His mother was no longer here to understand. She was here to control. Principal Wells stepped forward, palms half raised. "Mrs. Halbrook, please." "No," the woman snapped, her manicured finger waving through the air like she could rewrite the moment with her outrage. "I want to know why my son is being singled out and humiliated. What kind of school brings in military men to publicly shame teenagers?" She finally turned her gaze to Elijah, her mouth opening, then freezing. Recognition flashed behind her eyes. Elijah didn't flinch. He stood still as stone, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in fury but in confirmation. He knew her. She hadn't changed much. She had once worn a courtroom blazer instead of a cream cashmere sweater. But her voice, her arrogance, those were timeless. "You," she said, her voice lower now, uncertain. "You're." Elijah's voice was calm, steady, and far too clear to be interrupted. "I remember you." The word silenced her more effectively than any shout. 17 years ago, she'd sat behind her husband during a court-martial hearing. Not military, but federal. A civil suit filed against a soldier who had spoken up about racial misconduct in a classified military unit. Elijah had testified. Her husband had cross-examined him, called him combative, questioned his loyalty, dismantled his career using language dipped in formality but dripping with racial bias. And she had sat there, smiling faintly, nodding as her husband buried him. Now she stood in front of him, pretending to be shocked by consequences. "My son didn't know," she said, trying to pivot, voice trembling now. "He's just a kid. They all are." Elijah's reply came like thunder after lightning, slow, certain, and devastating. "They never need to know to be cruel." A hush fell over the auditorium again. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't insult. That wasn't his weapon. His weapon was truth, delivered like a scalpel, sharp and precise. And the more he spoke, the more every adult in the room saw themselves in the mirror he held up. "No one taught him to laugh at my limp," Elijah continued. "No one forced him to mock my walk. He learned it from silence. Yours." He turned toward the rows of faculty along the side aisles. The ones who always looked away when he passed. The ones who asked him to fix things without ever learning his name. The ones who chuckled behind coffee cups when students whispered cruel things just out of earshot. "You didn't call me names," Elijah said, "but you didn't call out the ones who did either." Ms. Cranston's eyes filled with tears. Coach Freeman looked down at his shoes. Mr. Langley swallowed hard and closed his gradebook. That's how racism survives, Elijah said softly. Not just with slurs, but with indifference, with smiles when we're silent, with promotions handed to cowards and punishment handed to the brave. Jason's mother straightened her shoulders again, trying to reclaim the ground she had lost. You're making this too personal. They didn't know what you'd been through. And they didn't care, Elijah interrupted, gaze locked on hers, because caring would have cost them comfort, and that's never been the currency they're willing to spend. General Donovan stepped forward now, eyes fierce. I've watched young men cry over fallen brothers, he said, but I've never seen a mother cry this loud for her child's ego. Your son mocked a war hero. That's not trauma, that's arrogance meeting consequences. The silence was brutal. Then a student in the back stood up slowly, a girl named Sadie. She raised her hand. Can I say something? Principal Wells nodded. Sadie turned to Elijah. I didn't laugh, but I never said anything either, and I'm sorry, you didn't deserve that. Another student stood, then another. Quiet apologies, soft acknowledgments, a wave of awakening. No one was performing. They were processing, and realizing that the silence they had worn like comfort was more violent than any insult. Elijah nodded slowly, but didn't smile. I don't need your guilt, he said. I just need you to see. His voice softened again, deeper now. The cruelty isn't just in the act. It's in the freedom to forget it afterward. You'll walk out of here and talk about how powerful this assembly was, but some of us carry that weight every single day. Jason's mother didn't respond. She had nothing left to say. Her weapon, self-righteousness, had been disarmed. She turned without a word and left the auditorium, the click of her heels sounding like retreat. Principal Wells wiped her eyes and stepped forward, clearing her throat. We will be issuing a formal apology on behalf of the school, she began. But she was cut off by the quiet buzz of a phone. General Donovan looked at his device. His brow lifted slightly as he read the message. Then he turned to Elijah with a look of solemn respect. It's from the Pentagon, he said quietly. They want you to come to D.C. next week. The auditorium went silent again. They're formally recognizing your actions, Donovan continued. They want to speak in person, and they want you to speak too, to the next generation of cadets. Black, white, brown, all of them. Elijah said nothing, but his eyes said everything. And for the first time since the war, he looked proud. As Elijah stepped off the stage, someone in the back row slipped out the door quietly, a student none of them noticed much. A student who had filmed the hallway mockery, and was now editing it with a new caption. This man isn't our janitor, he's the standard. The video would reach 1 million views by morning, and Elijah Darnell's silence was about to roar. Elijah Darnell stood in his closet-like office behind the gym, holding the envelope in his hands like it was a grenade with the pin already pulled. The Pentagon seal was embossed on the front, official, formal, cold, the kind of envelope that most men would frame. But Elijah didn't move to open it. Not yet. Outside, the hallway buzzed faintly. Since the assembly, the school had shifted. Teachers looked him in the eye now, but with a hesitation, like they were still trying to reconcile the man they'd ignored with the soldier the country now wanted to celebrate. Students no longer whispered when he passed. Instead, they watched him, wide-eyed, reverent, unsure. Elijah set the envelope down gently and sat on the small wooden bench by the wall. A faint draft from the nearby vent rustled the paper, and for a moment he stared at it, not in anticipation, but memory. Because he had seen letters like this before. Flashback 2003. A young Elijah sits in a military hospital, leg bandaged, IV in his arm. A man in a crisp suit, not military, not family, stands at the foot of his bed with a clipboard. We're denying the citation, the man says flatly. Elijah stares. I pulled 3 men out under fire. We appreciate your service, the man says, voice robotic, but your report contradicts the official account. I am the official account, Elijah replies. You're dismissed with full medical. No medal? Thank you for your sacrifice. The man leaves, the door clicks shut. Elijah turns to the metal citation draft he had been handed before. The name at the top is his. The description is poetic, valor, leadership, courage. But in red ink, a thick stamp reads, revoked. Present day. Elijah blinked, the memory retreating like a fog, slow but stubborn. He finally opened the envelope. The letter was simple, sterile. It apologized, not for what had been done, but for what had not. It extended an invitation to Washington, D.C., for a formal recognition ceremony. He was to receive the Distinguished Service Cross, again, this time publicly, this time with his name unedited, This time, maybe too late. It wasn't just a ceremony. The letter also requested his presence as a speaker at the National Memorial for African American Veterans, a tribute planned for spring, broadcast nationwide. They wanted his words now. The same ones they ignored 2 decades ago. Across the country, Elijah's story had ignited. After the student's edited video went viral overnight, national media latched on. Cable anchors called him a forgotten hero. Online profiles titled him, "The Janitor Who Was a Warrior." Old military buddies, some white, some black, emerged from the woodwork, submitting statements, photos, stories that confirmed everything Donovan had said. A military historian on NPR said, Elijah Darnell may be one of the most decorated buried names in post-9/11 service history. The country that had erased him was now trying to draw him back in ink. But the question that lingered, louder than applause, bigger than headlines, was simple. Would he go? Donovan called him that evening. "You should come," the general said. "Let them face you." Elijah was silent on the other end of the line. "They're asking for your voice now, Elijah," Donovan said. "They only ask when silence starts costing them something," Elijah replied. Donovan exhaled. "You're not wrong. But this isn't for them anymore. It's for everyone watching. Every kid in every school who sees someone like you and finally learns what respect actually looks like." Another long silence. Finally, Elijah said, "I'll think about it." He hung up first. The next day at school, several teachers left notes in his supply closet. Some said thank you. Others asked for forgiveness in thinly veiled paragraphs. Ms. Cranston brought him a sandwich and left it quietly on the bench without a word. He never touched it. In the staff lounge, the air was heavier now. Some still didn't speak to him, not out of hate but shame, because their silence had become too loud to ignore. That night, Elijah returned to the letter. He read it again, and again. His fingers trembled slightly on the edge, not with fear, but with fatigue. Emotional fatigue. The kind that only comes after a life spent pushing boulders up hills built by others. He thought about the speech they wanted him to give. What could he say? That it felt hollow now? That medals don't clean pain? That no ceremony could scrub the years they took? He remembered Sergeant Thompson, a black man who died in Kandahar with 2 gunshots to the chest and 1 in the back from friendly fire. Elijah had carried his body out in a tarp. The official record called it an accident. Elijah never forgot. He remembered Corporal Vance, who had warned him before the tribunal, "They'll never let you speak without a price," and then was reassigned overseas without explanation. He remembered the courtroom, where Jason's father tore through his testimony like it was a lie written in mud. And now the same system wanted him to teach its children about honor. The irony wasn't lost on him. That night he wrote a response, not on a keyboard, but by hand. It was only 5 words. He slid the paper into the return envelope, sealed it, and placed it on the desk beside the medals Donovan had returned to him after the assembly. He would mail it the next morning. The next morning came. The envelope was gone. And in its place, a new one sat. This one wasn't from the Pentagon. It was handwritten. And it was from the White House. Elijah sat alone in his small room that night, the yellowed light from a cracked desk lamp casting shadows on the walls. The unopened envelope with the White House seal sat on the table in front of him like a loaded question, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, his hand slid into the drawer beneath the desk, a drawer few knew existed, and pulled out a small torn photograph. It was old, creased, faded at the edges. 2 boys stood in front of a one-room house, both barefoot, both black, both beaming in a way that didn't belong to poverty. One of them was Elijah, 11. The other, barely older, was his brother, Solomon. The photo was the last one ever taken of them together. Elijah leaned back slowly in his chair, eyes tracing every wrinkle in the image, but his mind had already slipped years back to Mississippi, 1973, to the summer Solomon was killed. He had only been 15. The official report said he drowned. The body was found floating in the bayou behind a white-owned property. But everyone in the black part of town knew what really happened. Solomon had dared to talk back to a sheriff's son, dared to be brilliant, dared to question why his school got torn up textbooks, while the one across town got new ones every fall. He was planning to organize, to march, to speak. And just like that, his voice was gone. No trial, no names, no justice. Elijah learned the lesson early. Speaking gets you killed. So when he joined the military at 17, papers forged with the help of a neighbor, he thought he was escaping the grip of small-town hate. He thought the army, with its crisp uniforms and colorblind slogans, would be different, structured, fair. But boot camp was its own battlefield. "Hey boy, A drill sergeant once spat at him. Why you walk like you own the place? He didn't answer. You'll answer when I talk to you, Blackie. He still didn't answer. Because he knew the answer wouldn't matter. In training, he was ignored until he was needed, overlooked until he excelled, and punished when he surpassed. Promotions dangled in front of him like bait, then handed to men who arrived 6 months after he did. Men with soft jaws and paler names. But Elijah stayed. Not because he was naive, because he was strategic. He wanted to go where the fight was clearest, not in backwoods counties or segregated schools, but in war zones. There, bullets didn't care about skin color, at least not at first. And for a while it worked. He rose through the ranks, made sergeant, then master sergeant. His record gleamed, his discipline unmatched. But even in the desert, racism found him. It found him in the form of officers who called him aggressive when he gave direct orders. It found him in the smirks of squadmates who questioned whether he earned his stripes or just got lucky. It found him when his warnings during an intel briefing were ignored, warnings that could have prevented an ambush. And it found him most brutally when he was ordered to falsify a report that blamed a failed mission on internal confusion, code for his leadership, even though the failure came from a white major who panicked and left his team behind. When Elijah refused, the price was everything. His medals, his command, his reputation. They didn't need to discharge him loudly. They just uninvited him from the war. Years later, when Donovan found him working nights at a hardware store, he barely recognized the man who had once saved his life under rocket fire. But Elijah hadn't changed. He had simply buried the part of himself that had once believed in fairness. He took the janitor job not because he couldn't aim higher, but because he was tired of aiming for systems rigged to fail him. In a school hallway, no one demanded silence. No one called him boy. No one denied him truth because of rank. Peace, not pride, became his currency. And that's why he stayed silent. Because silence, at least, was his own. But now his silence was cracking. Not because of fame, not because of the Pentagon, but because he realized that his story, his pain, might mean something to someone still lost inside the same silence. The phone buzzed, rattling the desk. A number he didn't recognize. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. The third time, he picked it up. The voice on the other end was cautious, male, southern. Elijah? He hesitated. Who's this? A pause. Then it's Decker, Travis Decker, 2nd Battalion, Kandahar. Elijah's breath caught. He hadn't heard that name in years. Travis had been one of the quieter white guys in their squad. Younger, observant, never cruel, but never courageous enough to speak up either. The kind who blended in with silence and regret. I saw the news, Travis continued. Saw the video. And I remembered what you did. Elijah didn't reply. I should have said something back then, Travis added. I was scared. I was wrong. Still, Elijah said nothing. I'm in DC now, Travis continued. Work with vet advocacy, and we want you to come. Not just for the medal, for something else, something bigger. What? Elijah asked finally. They're creating a task force, Travis said, to investigate discrimination in military record keeping. Real cases, real reparations. They want you to help lead it. Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. I'm not looking to be anyone's hero, he said. Travis's voice softened. You already are. You just didn't ask for the cape. Elijah closed his eyes. The ache in his leg pulsed. The silence inside him, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Maybe the world wasn't different, but maybe his voice could be. He ended the call. Didn't say yes. Didn't say no. Just stared at the photo of his brother again. Solomon had wanted to be a teacher, had wanted to change the South from the inside. Elijah had chosen the battlefield instead. Different roads, same scars. Now the world wanted to hear him speak, not just for himself, but for men like Solomon. Men they never got a letter for. The next morning, Elijah found an envelope under his door. It wasn't from the Pentagon or the White House. It was from Jason. And inside was something Elijah hadn't expected. A copy of Solomon's death certificate. With a note, I think I found what they never wanted you to see. The envelope sat on Elijah's desk like a ghost that had finally found its way home. He opened it with the care of a man diffusing memory. Inside was a photocopy of an official document, yellowed edges, typewritten text, government seals, death certificate, Solomon Darnell, cause accidental drowning. But something was off. A second sheet was attached, clipped neatly behind the first. It was a local sheriff's report, unsigned. It described the boy's reputation for agitation, his tendency to incite tension at school, and his frequent trespassing near private properties. The word aggressive appeared 3 times. Jason had found it. Somehow, Elijah didn't know how, didn't ask. But he sat in silence for a long time, reading the same lines over and over, his hand unmoving. They wrote him out, Elijah murmured to himself, voice raspy. Not just of life, but of meaning. The next morning, he arrived at school before the sun rose, as always. The air smelled like coming rain. No students yet, just silence, the kind he used to value but now found hard to sit with. He was restocking cleaning supplies when someone knocked on the hallway door. Elijah opened it slowly. The man standing there wore a worn bomber jacket and carried a nervous sort of stillness. He looked older than he probably was. His hair had grayed along the temples, his eyes downcast. But when he looked up, Elijah recognized him instantly. Trent Masters, Elijah said, his voice flat but alert. Trent nodded. It's been a while. Kandahar, Elijah said. January 2002. Trent swallowed hard. You pulled me out from under the second Humvee. I still remember the heat and the smell. Elijah nodded once. I remember everything. They stood there in silence for a beat too long. Then Trent spoke again. I should have spoken up. I knew what they were doing to you wasn't right. I knew that officer lied in the tribunal. And I stayed quiet, because I was scared. Elijah didn't move. I was a coward, Trent continued, his voice cracking now. You saved me, and I watched them ruin you. I watched you disappear, and I did nothing. Finally, Elijah gestured for him to come inside. They sat on 2 overturned buckets near the janitor's closet, surrounded by old supplies and locked-away tools. I didn't expect you, Elijah said. I saw the news, Trent said. Didn't believe it until I saw your face. Then, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing your voice on the comms, barking orders while the world burned around us. Trent pulled something from his coat, a dog tag. Yours, he said. You lost it that day. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe guilt, maybe hope. He handed it over. Elijah took it silently, ran his thumb over the etched metal. For the first time in years, he let a memory return fully. Kandahar. Trent was trapped beneath a flipped vehicle, flames licking closer, ammunition popping off like firecrackers. Elijah had gone back twice already, then a third time, dragged Trent out with nothing but sheer will and a half-working leg. Afterward, Trent had stood at the tribunal, said nothing while others lied. Now here he was offering memory like a confession. You were scared, Elijah said finally. But fear ain't the crime. Silence is. Trent's eyes welled up. I want to help fix this. I want to testify now, make it public. We've got people listening now, Congress, Pentagon, media. Elijah looked at him, not with anger, not even disappointment. Just quiet measure. It won't bring Solomon back, Elijah said. No, Trent agreed, but maybe it'll stop another kid like him from being written out. Elijah didn't answer right away. He stared at the dog tag in his palm, the metal warming slowly in his grasp. Then he nodded. One truth at a time. Meanwhile, the students at Crestfield High had become obsessed. After the assembly, something had cracked open. It started with a few ROTC kids pulling Elijah's service number and digging into military archives. Then came a student podcast, hosted by a senior named Ray, that featured a 3-part special, The Legend in the Hallway. They dug up photos, articles, interviews, old deployment lists. By Friday, Elijah had a Wikipedia page. By Saturday, it had been updated 6 times. Clips from the assembly reached 3 million views. The hallway mocking video, once a symbol of cruelty, was now viral with captions like "From Janitor to Warrior." Students who had never noticed Elijah before now nodded at him in the halls. Some apologized in passing. Others said nothing, but watched him like a man guarding sacred ground. In Miss Cranston's history class, a student raised their hand. Why don't we name the school after him? Cranston paused. I don't know, she admitted, but that's a good question. That night, the school board convened, a session that had originally been scheduled to discuss budgets and cafeteria upgrades. But things had changed.
A new motion had been added to the agenda, quietly, by Principal Wells.
It read, Proposal to rename Crestfield High to Darnell Honor Academy. The room was packed. Teachers, students, parents, local news. Donovan sat in the back row, arms folded. Elijah wasn't there. He'd been invited. He declined. The board chair cleared his throat. Before we vote, any comments? A junior student stood. I didn't even know our school had a name that meant anything. It was just a place. But now when I walk through the halls, I think about who's earned that name. Another teacher stood. He was never just a janitor. He was a lesson we refused to learn. A pause. Then the vote began. Yes, yes, yes. 1 abstain. Final vote, 5-01. Motion passed. Crestfield High would become Darnell Honor Academy. The announcement was met with stunned applause, but one hand didn't clap. In the back row, a man in a dark coat stood silently and walked out. He wasn't media. He wasn't staff. He was a former state representative, and the last man to deny Elijah his tribunal medal in 2003. He left without saying a word. But someone filmed it, and someone recognized him. The next day, a news story broke. Retired judge linked to racism scandal at military tribunal. Same man who resigned after blocking Medal of Honor review. And suddenly the country didn't just want to honor Elijah Darnell. It wanted to correct him into history. The letter stayed on Elijah's locker shelf for 2 full days before he unfolded it again. Not because he was avoiding it, but because he already knew what it said. He could feel the weight of the apology in the way the envelope had been sealed. Not with fear, not with guilt, but with something rarer: sincerity. Jason had written it by hand, unlined paper. Neat but nervous handwriting. The kind of script you use when you're not sure if your words will be allowed into someone's soul. Elijah sat in his small janitor's closet. The door cracked slightly, the hallway outside humming with the muffled shuffle of teenagers between classes. But in his space it was quiet. Always quiet. He read the letter slowly, letting each sentence breathe. Mr. Darnell, I've thought about what to say 100 different ways. All of them felt too small. Maybe that's the point. You were never small. You were never invisible. I just needed you to be, so I didn't have to see what was broken in me. My father once told me, don't let people like him make you feel guilty. I didn't ask what people like him meant, because I already knew. I grew up with privilege I didn't earn and pride I didn't deserve. You reminded me just by being you, that strength doesn't yell, it walks quietly through hell and keeps going. And that terrified me. I mocked what I feared. Not your limp, not your silence, but your calm. Because calm can only live inside someone who's survived something I can't imagine. You were stronger than my father, and I couldn't stand it. I don't know how to erase what I did, but I'm learning that maybe the goal isn't erasure. It's transformation. And I want to change. Not just for you, for every man I was taught not to see. Thank you for letting us hear your story, and for not breaking us with your silence even when we deserved it. I'm sorry. Jason. Elijah read it twice, then a third time, then folded it again and placed it beside the photo of Solomon and the medal he never accepted, the Distinguished Service Cross. There was no fanfare, no speech, but inside him, something loosened. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering differently. Not softening the pain, but dulling its bite long enough to let growth happen in its shadow. Because pain, like racism, doesn't vanish with a single apology. But it can be disarmed. And hate, when faced with truth and grace, can fall quiet. That afternoon, Elijah walked through the main hallway. Students parted, not with fear, but with the kind of reverence given to veterans at parades. A few nodded. Some said Mr. Darnell, in soft, almost embarrassed tones. But Jason didn't approach him. Not out of fear, out of respect. Elijah stopped briefly in front of the new school sign, Darnell Hall of Honor, and placed his hand gently on the polished bronze. Not for the cameras, not for the crowd, just for Solomon. Just for every brother who never made it out of the silence. That evening, he sat at home. The dog-tagged Trent had returned to him lying beside his phone. The room was dim, filled only by the low hum of a fan and the distant sound of traffic outside his window. His voicemail buzzed, a new message. He played it without checking the number. A woman's voice, smooth but certain, spoke into the quiet. Mr. Darnell, my name is Lisette Monroe. I'm a documentary filmmaker producer for Invisible Valor, the series on buried military legacies. Your story is the one we've been searching for. Elijah's brow furrowed. I've spoken to General Donovan, to your former unit members, and even to some of the students at your school. We'd like to dedicate an entire episode, no dramatization, just truth. Your truth. There was a brief pause in the recording. Then the tone softened. We don't want to speak about you, Mr. Darnell. We want the country to hear you speak for yourself. A final pause. Then the message ended with a number and a promise. We believe America is finally ready to listen. Elijah stared at the phone. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't sure what to say. The next morning, when Elijah returned to school, a film crew was already waiting outside. But it wasn't the documentary team. It was national news. And behind them, stepping out of a van marked Federal Courier, was a woman in a Navy suit holding a locked case. And she was asking for Master Sergeant Elijah Darnell, by name. Elijah stood in the parking lot of Darnell Hall of Honor, sunlight bleeding across the asphalt, as a woman in a dark suit approached him carrying a locked metal case. The camera crew nearby watched in silence. Microphones were lowered. This wasn't a moment for spectacle. It was something else, something rarer. "Master Sergeant Elijah Darnell?" she asked, her voice calm but official. Elijah nodded once. "I'm with the Department of Defense Archives," she said. "This case contains the sealed portion of your service record, declassified this morning per executive order. We've been asked to deliver it in person." Elijah didn't speak. He simply reached out, took the case, and nodded again. She hesitated, then added, softer now, "Thank you for surviving." He walked away slowly, the case in hand, his limp just as steady, just as dignified. The news broke that evening. Declassified, Sergeant Elijah Darnell's true record. What America buried. The people are finally seeing. Across the country, newspapers and television anchors scrambled to catch up. What had begun as a viral school video had now become a national reckoning. Elijah's story, once whispered between classroom walls and locker doors, was now loud enough to echo through Washington. CNN ran a special report. MSNBC hosted a town hall. Veterans groups flooded social media with posts tagged "Darnell deserved better." But it wasn't just Elijah's story they were finally listening to. It was a pattern. Black soldiers erased from history, decorated men denied recognition, names missing from monuments. And for the first time in decades, the silence was being treated not as oversight, but as intent. Elijah sat in his modest living room. The silver case opened on the table before him. Inside, copies of reports once labeled confidential, testimony from soldiers who'd fought beside him, audio recordings from radios during the Kandahar ambush, all confirming what he already knew. He'd saved lives. He'd spoken truth. And they'd buried it. Not because it was false, because it was inconvenient. Beside the documents lay a formal invitation. This one not from the Pentagon or the school board. It was from the White House. Signed by the president. Lizette Monroe, the documentary filmmaker, sat across from him, a quiet camera crew in tow. She didn't direct him, didn't prompt. She simply asked one question. "When did you stop being silent?" Elijah leaned forward, fingers locked, voice low. "When I realized the silence wasn't protecting me anymore. It was protecting them." The documentary, titled Buried Valor, The Cost of Being Seen, aired 3 weeks later. It shattered viewership records on PBS, then was picked up by a major streaming service within days. But what no one expected, not even Elijah, was the reaction from the youth. High schools across the nation began organizing assemblies around the film. College professors rewrote curriculum modules overnight. Military institutions launched internal reviews into long-ignored racism in recognition and promotion practices. And Elijah became the reluctant voice of a generation raised on war movies that never included men who looked like him, unless they were side characters. In the final 10 minutes of the documentary, there is no music, no dramatization, just a shot of Elijah, seated in his old janitor's closet. He reads aloud, not from a speech, from Jason's letter. His voice breaks only once, not at the apology, but at the line. "I mocked what I feared, a man stronger than my father." Cut to Jason, sitting alone in the auditorium where it all began. His eyes red, the folded letter in his hand, and a single sentence recorded in a voiceover. "I spent years building a legacy that wasn't mine, but he built one I'll never forget." In homes across the country, viewers wept. For Elijah. For the brothers like Solomon. For the men whose uniforms couldn't protect them from the truth of their skin. And for the reckoning they all knew was long overdue. Elijah received hundreds of letters in the weeks that followed. From soldiers, from mothers, from strangers. One note stood out, a single sentence. "You were never invisible. We just had to open our damn eyes." Then came the final invitation. A private ceremony. A public tribute. The White House. No camera crew this time. No interview. Just an honor long delayed and finally undeniable. As Elijah stood on the front steps, pressed suit, medals neatly pinned, Solomon's photo tucked in his breast pocket, he looked up at the columns and whispered something only he could hear. Then, He stepped through the doors. Inside, in the East Room, the crowd stood. But at the front of the line, wearing a familiar uniform, eyes filled with something like guilt wrapped in reverence, was a name Elijah hadn't heard in decades: Colonel Jacob Vance, the man who had once testified against him at the tribunal, now waiting to salute. The East Room of the White House was a blend of reverence and restraint, chandeliers casting gold light across polished floors, silence blanketing the room like a prayer waiting to be spoken. Rows of dignitaries stood in quiet anticipation, uniforms crisp, cameras hushed, not a soul fidgeted. And at the center of it all, walking with slow precision, was Master Sergeant Elijah Darnell. He wore his dress uniform, black and regal, the fabric pressed and gleaming like a man rediscovered. On his chest, his restored medals were lined with exacting symmetry: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and now, to be added, the Medal of Valor. But there was something else pinned near his heart, something less official, yet far more sacred. A folded photograph of his brother Solomon, tucked neatly inside a transparent case, visible, unspoken. Elijah's face bore no smile, yet something in his expression felt lighter, as though gravity had relented after years of punishing weight. At the front of the stage, the president stood tall, flanked by generals and secretaries. And next to him was Colonel Jacob Vance. The same Vance who once stood behind a tribunal bench, offering clipped, sterile testimony that diluted Elijah's bravery into unverifiable field accounts. Now he stood not to testify, but to salute. As Elijah approached, Vance's shoulders straightened, his eyes brimmed, a shimmer of regret decades old. "I failed you," he whispered as Elijah came near. Elijah paused, just slightly, eyes locked with Vance's. Then, with calm that transcended the years between them, he replied, "I carried you anyway." Then he stepped forward to the podium. The president addressed the room. "Today we honor not just a soldier, but a sentinel of silent strength. Elijah Darnell did what many of us could not. He told the truth when truth cost everything. He sacrificed not just his body, but his recognition, his peace, his place in the nation's memory. But memory, as we've learned, is repairable." He turned to Elijah, "And today, we begin to repair it." The Medal of Valor was lowered onto Elijah's shoulders with solemn care. Applause erupted, but it wasn't the kind given to politicians or celebrities. It was the sound of respect finally catching up to reality. In the back of the East Room, among the crowd, sat Jason Halbrook. He wore a simple black suit. No tie. Eyes locked on Elijah. No camera captured him. No spotlight sought him out. But tears slid silently down his face, because he now understood. He hadn't just mocked a janitor. He'd desecrated a monument he didn't recognize. Elijah turned, scanning the room. He didn't search for the generals or the cameras. He looked for the students. And when he saw them seated off to the side, a special invitation having brought them here, he paused. He raised his hand slowly and saluted them. A full, crisp, formal salute. The kind a leader gives his successors. The kind that says, "This history is yours now. Carry it better than I had to." And the room fell still again. Because in that moment, Elijah Darnell wasn't just a recipient of valor. He was a teacher, a mirror, a reckoning. And Jason whispered under his breath, words no mic could catch. He was never just a janitor. He was the lesson we refused to learn. As the ceremony ended, the room rose again in ovation. But Elijah didn't linger. He didn't bask. He stepped down, medals clinking faintly, hands steady on the railing. Outside, the lawn shimmered in the late afternoon light. Dozens of cameras waited. But Elijah turned to the side, avoiding the press, and walked quietly toward a bench shaded by magnolia trees. There, he sat alone, removed his cap, and looked up at the sky. Final hook. Because true strength isn't found in loud voices, medals, or marches. It's found in the man who walks through fire with no one watching, and keeps walking anyway. As the credits rolled on the televised broadcast that night, one final image lingered. Elijah standing in front of Darnell Hall of Honor, students filing in behind him, a bronze plaque glinting in the sun, and engraved on it just 5 words. He mopped floors, and history. The screen faded to black. And the silence that followed felt like respect. If this story moved you, if Elijah Darnell's journey made you think, feel, or even look at the world a little differently, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel to explore more untold stories, the ones history buried and society ignored. Like and share this video so others can learn what real strength looks like, Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that endures. Because the more we share stories like Elijah's, the harder it becomes to forget the people we were never supposed to overlook. Let's keep honoring truth together. The scaffolding went up early, long before the final bell rang. Overnight, workers in reflective vests arrived with steel ladders and power drills. The letters Crestfield High School were unscrewed, one by one, until the last remnant of its past slid quietly into a box on the ground. No announcements, no ceremony, just the sound of screws giving way and history being rewritten with every tug. Elijah Darnell stood across the courtyard, watching. He wore his uniform, the janitor's one, still navy blue, still creased to military sharpness. No medals on his chest, no patches, just the key ring at his hip, clinking faintly in rhythm with his breath. The new sign arrived in a black truck, shielded beneath a tarp. 4 workers unwrapped it slowly, revealing dark bronze letters on a polished oak panel. Darnell Hall of Honor. Estet 2025. Beneath it, in smaller script, dedicated to the courage we overlooked, and the silence we ignored. The crowd behind him was modest. Students, faculty, a few parents, a camera crew from a local station. Donovan stood off to the side, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing. Principal Wells gave a brief speech, but the words were mostly background noise. Everyone knew who the day belonged to. Elijah didn't cry. He didn't smile either. He just stood there, hands behind his back straight, the same posture he'd held under mortar fire in Kandahar, the same one he kept while being interrogated in court, and the same one he maintained every morning while mopping vomit off locker room tiles. Because honor doesn't demand applause. It demands memory. The students who had once mocked him now stood in the front row, quiet, their expressions unreadable. Jason, Chase, and Derek wore simple gray t-shirts with the school's new crest printed on them, the one Elijah had helped design after the vote passed. A rising eagle, wings made of interlocking hands. They weren't punished, not formally, but Principal Wells had arranged something more fitting. They had been assigned weekly volunteer hours at the local Veterans Center downtown, not to be shamed, but to learn. Jason had spent 3 weekends helping amputees walk through physical therapy. Chase had worked with a retired medic suffering from PTSD. Derek had been assigned to archive decades of military letters, reading stories of men and women who never came home. They didn't complain. Something in them had shifted, not in a performative way, but in that deep, unsettling way. Change settles inside you when your comfort is finally replaced by truth. That afternoon, as the final bolts locked the new sign in place, students and teachers applauded softly. Principal Wells approached Elijah. "We could arrange a formal speech," she said. "Media would love it." Elijah looked up at the sign again. "No need," he said. And then finally, his lips curved, not into a grin, but something more sacred, a knowing. She nodded and stepped away. As the crowd began to disperse, Jason lingered. He didn't approach Elijah, not then, not in front of the others. Instead, he slipped back inside the building through the east hallway, taking one last look at the polished bronze letters gleaming in the sunlight. He made his way to the janitor's closet, the one beneath the stairs. Inside, where Elijah kept the worn mop, the rusted shelf, the folded photo of Solomon beneath the towel, Jason placed a white envelope on the bench and walked away. Elijah wouldn't find it until much later, long after the crowd had left, and the lights had dimmed and the building was quiet again. But when he did, he'd unfold it with the same precision he gave to everything. It read, "Mr. Darnell, they say you learn from your mistakes. But sometimes, you don't really learn. You just finally see. I used to laugh at you because I thought that made me powerful. But it didn't. It just proved I was afraid. Afraid of what I didn't understand. Afraid of the dignity you carried without asking for it. Afraid that someone with a limp and a broom could be more of a man than anyone I'd ever met. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to read this all the way through. But I need you to know something. The day you told us I buried better men than all of you, something broke in me. Not my pride, my blindness. Thank you for letting us see. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the name above that door." Jason. Elijah folded the letter slowly and placed it inside his locker beside Solomon's photo. He didn't say a word, but for the first time in decades, he let himself sit down, not because he was tired, but because he had nothing left to prove. That evening, as he locked the closet and turned off the light, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't the Pentagon. It was a number with a Texas area code. And a voicemail transcription blinked on the screen.
Mr. Darnell, I'm the director of the National Archives. We found something in your sealed file, something that might change everything.